is CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. Attacks continue in northern Ukraine despite Russia's pledge to withdraw. We hear from the mayor of Kyiv.
We're living in war condition and doing everything to save the life of our citizens.
Our other headlines: China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi meets his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov, the first face-to-face meeting since the invasion of Ukraine.
Germany sets out emergency plans to manage gas supplies, which could include rationing.
And the end of the road, the French car maker Renault could hand its Russian operations to a Russian investor. Russia's pledge to withdraw its troops near the cities of Kyiv and Chernihiv has been met with skepticism by Ukraine and its Western allies. Moscow says it's stopping attacks to build trust for peace talks and to focus its forces on eastern regions.
But British intelligence says Russian soldiers have been forced to withdraw and regroup due to Ukrainian resistance. And the mayor of Chernihiv says attacks on the city are continuing. Let's talk now to our correspondent Yolo Abdavith, who is in Lviv in Ukraine. Yolo, take us through the latest on the ground.
Well, that scepticism is definitely there in Chernihiv, of course, but also in some of the outskirts of Kyiv, because there has been artillery fire and shelling, and that sort of dampens the pledge, really, that the Russian armed forces have made, that they would pull back, not pull out, but then pull back and regroup. But obviously, a sizable contingent of soldiers have left, are staying where they are, and they are still shelling. And there have been several reports of that, even near Irpin, which saw heavy clashes a few weeks ago. The Ukrainian forces claimed that they were there and reclaiming that area yesterday, and there's been shelling there as well. So it's a complicated, unclear picture, and unless you are in these positions to verify yourself, it's hard really to gauge what is going on. But quite obviously, those hopes for peace are being dampened. And when I talk to Ukrainians here, and I ask them, well, you know, for how long can this go on? How long are you expecting this war to go on? And I must admit, so many Ukrainians say that they think this will go on a long time. And that's what they're fearful of, but in a way, that's what they're expecting.
And Yolo, the United Nations says that 4 million people have now left Ukraine. What are you seeing in Lviv?
Yes, more people are here. People are still arriving. I was at the main train station this morning, not half as busy as it has been, of course. But those trains with the blue trains and the long carriages are coming from the east. Obviously, they travel a long time, and it may take several days for some of those trains from Kharkiv, from Kramatorsk, to actually arrive here. It's amazing that those train services are still running as they were before the war, but they are. And there were still, you know, a few hundred people outside the main station here in Lviv who are still trying to get out of the country and go into Poland. But those figures of more than 4 million now have left the country. 6.5 million are refugees within this country. So that's almost a quarter of the population that have moved from their homes or been forced to move from their homes to remain safe. And it is, as always, it's women, it's children, it's the elderly, it's the infirm and the ill. These are the people that you see are travelling. These are the people who are trying to get out of the country, while, of course, many hundreds of thousands of people can't because they are trapped and there aren't enough security measures in place to allow them to flee some of the worst affected areas like Mariupol we've been talking about for so many weeks now.
Yolo Abdavith in Lviv, thank you.
Vitaly Klitschko is the mayor of Kyiv. I asked him for his reaction to those Russian claims that its forces were withdrawing around the capital.
Actually, we're happy to listen the Russian forces go away from Kyiv region, but we received the information yesterday evening. But during whole nights, we heard huge explosion around the Kyiv. We actually listen here in the middle of Kyiv. Explosion on the border of Kyiv. It's mean the battles still the fighting Ukrainian forces against the Russians forces to defend our hometown.
Ukraine has offered neutrality in those peace talks with Russia, no NATO membership. What would neutrality in Ukraine look like, and what would be acceptable to the people of Ukraine, do you think?
We was always a neutral country, and difficult to believe Russians, because it's 90, I want to go in the past time, 1994, for goodwill, Ukraine gave up the all nuclear weapons. We was the third country in the world with nuclear weapons, and the Russians also was the country who gave to us guarantee for our territorial integrity and independency. And after that, we have the case with occupied the Crimea, Donetsk, Lugansk, and right now the war in Ukraine. The Russian forces occupied the big part of our country. It's difficult after that to believe to some people who give the guarantee before.
We've been talking about the hoped-for future of the country. Give us a snapshot, if you would, of Ukraine and, in particular, your city, Kyiv, today. What's going on?
It's every day we have the attack to civilian apartments, destroy the buildings and killing the people. It's almost more than 80 buildings in our hometown already destroyed. More than 100 civilians died. More than 300 people injured. 4 children has died. 16 children right now in hospital in critical condition. And for yesterday we doesn't have an attack, and it's good news. By the way, we listen how our air defense shoot rockets, which the target is capital of Ukraine, and that's why it's people is nervous, and everybody hope in one day we have peace in our country. But I'm responsible for infrastructure in our hometown. Right now, thanks God, we have electricity, heating, and water. We have some reserve of humanitarian help, of food and water. It's good news. But everybody nervous because we listen to Syrian every day. It means everyone have to go to the bunkers, and some people spend weeks underground to save their life, for save his lives, and that's why right now we're living in a war condition, and doing everything to save the life of our citizens.
Millions of people, millions of refugees have fled the fighting in Ukraine. Whatever the outcome of these peace negotiations, Russia will still be your neighbour. Will those refugees who fled the country return, do you think?
We see the big part of people already moved back to Kyiv. It's majority the men's, because in the first action is we evacuate the women and children in the west part of our country. Some people traveling outside of the country to find a safety place, but some men's coming back to our hometown. they ready to defend homes, families, children, and defend future of our city, of our home country.
Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi and his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov also discussed Ukraine in their first face-to-face meeting since the Russian invasion. Our correspondent Dong Shui reports.
Earlier on Wednesday, Chinese State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi finished a closed-door meeting with his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov before the Foreign Ministerial Conference of Afghanistan's neighbors, which is scheduled to start tomorrow. Both Wang Yi and Lavrov have agreed to push the bilateral ties to a higher level based on the consensus reached by the two countries' presidents. They also talked about the security on the Korean Peninsula and the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Lavrov said Russia will continue peace talks with Ukraine and keep communicating with the international community. Wang said China supports the progress made so far, as well as efforts made by all parties to address the humanitarian crisis. He also stressed the importance of a balanced, effective, and sustainable way to ensure stability in the region through dialogue. Earlier, I also had the chance to talk to Lavrov regarding the latest talks in Istanbul. He said that he was satisfied with the results coming out from the talks held in Istanbul and stressed that most important thing for Russia is to ensure that Ukraine remains neutral and denuclearized and that Ukraine does not join NATO. He also claimed issues in Crimea and Donbas have been resolved. Well, this is Lavrov's first trip to China and will be his first public in-person appearance at a multilateral event since the Russia-Ukraine crisis. Obviously, this visit comes at a time when the partnership between China and Russia is attracting immense global attention following Russia's special military operation in Ukraine and Beijing's abstaining from a UN General Assembly vote to criticize Russia. Lavrov have earlier described that China-Russia relations are at all-time high, and Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi echoed the sentiment at a press conference during China's top political gathering, the two sessions early March, stressing that China's friendship with Russia is rock solid and prospects for cooperation are very broad. Dong Shui, CGTN.
Well, the Kremlin has played down hopes of a breakthrough after talks between Russia and Ukraine in Istanbul. Our correspondent Stuart Smith is in Moscow, and a quick reminder, Russia's new media law severely limits what correspondents in the country are able to report. Stuart, what has the Kremlin been saying about the Istanbul talks?
Yeah, Dmitry Peskov, the Russian president's spokesperson, had a different take than we heard from Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister there. He believes that there were no breakthroughs at these talks, that there is still a very, very long way to go and that little progress has been made. He did point to one piece of evidence that he suggests things are moving forwards. Compare that to previous statements where he said Ukraine was trying to jeopardize talks by slowing things down. He said that this time Ukraine came to the meetings prepared with proposals written on paper, its concerns as well as suggestions. And then about what the foreign minister Sergei Lavrov just said there about the issue of Crimea and Donbass being resolved, that's not something the Ukrainian delegation is talking about. Indeed, the lead negotiator of the Ukrainian side spoke of Crimea being on the negotiating table again, rather than being something which is resolved. So at this point, it seems there may be different negotiators talking to their domestic audiences with perhaps different takes on what came out of these talks. But from the Russian perspective, the lead negotiator there, who's obviously been involved with these talks since the very beginning, his assessment was that there was some progress made on some key issues. He said, one, that the discussions around whether Ukraine should join NATO have been resolved. Ukraine's willing not to join NATO if it can also secure appropriate security guarantees, that it's willing to not host nuclear weapons on its territory and nor host foreign fighters on its territory. And in addition to that, there's this agreement that Ukraine would not undertake military drills without the approval of so-called guarantor states such as Russia. But the big problem for Russia going ahead is Ukraine still insists on some kind of referendum to wrap up these negotiations before they could become law. And before a referendum, Russia would have to remove all its troops from Ukrainian territory first. Two big hurdles to any final agreement.
Stuart, we've been talking about economic sanctions on Russia for weeks, and now a new law has been passed making so-called parallel imports legal. What more can you tell us about this?
Yeah, all part of the government strategy to try and tackle the economic consequences of Western sanctions. Parallel imports means quite simply that previously, whereas Nike, Apple, H&M may have been able to directly import into Russia, they've now chosen not to. And so the government here would still like their products to be available to Russian citizens. The Prime Minister, Mikhail Mishustin, says there's high demand and it would help stabilise prices. So what this law does is it allows wholesalers outside of Russia to import those products to their warehouses and then sell them on to the Russian Federation. Previously, that was illegal, and then those goods would have been burned if they'd been found out to have been brought through using a parallel import system. Now the Prime Minister says that's OK and will help support the economy.
Stuart, thanks for that. Stuart Smith, our correspondent in Moscow.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, Spain's shortages, how rationing is helping to reduce the economic impact of the Ukraine invasion.
The British public not only need to know, but they want to know more about China.
70 years ago, a small group of British businessmen travelled to China to unlock opportunities between the two countries. They became known as the icebreakers.
East meets West. We're now at a time when we need the icebreaker spirit.
My first impression when I came to China is I noticed the similarities more than the differences.
It's about understanding each other's culture.
We look at the things that bring our nations together.
My dad is Chinese, my mum is English. I grew up in London, but I went to China to work at age 25.
Whenever I've gone to China, it's just been amazingly welcoming.
The music is beautiful language and bringing all the people together.
I'm exploring, I'm experimenting, I'm trying something new, all in the hopes to build a bridge. And I think we definitely need more people doing that.
It was only when I got to know my Chinese father in my 40s that I really got to know the other half of myself.
I hope we make it another 50 years, another 500 years.
Meet the bridge builders, the individuals who dared to think beyond the horizon and to open up our world, on TV and online on CGTN.
I hope that you will all become icebreakers and bridge builders.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. Just a reminder that CGTN is available to watch for free on all the major digital platforms, on Smart TV or online on Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube and Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app, and in the UK on Freeview.
Germany has taken the first steps that could lead to rationing gas, activating an emergency law designed to deal with energy shortages.
It comes after Moscow said it would demand payment for its commodities in rubles from what it called unfriendly countries. Well, Kingsmill Bond is an energy strategist at RMI and he joins us now. Welcome to the programme. So Germany on the point of introducing gas rationing. How significant would that be?
Very significant. In the short term, this is going to be extremely painful. We don't have a huge number of options in the short term. You have LNG and you've got rationing and you've got efficiency. But fortunately, in the long term, there are plenty of solutions really around renewables and efficiency. So we need to distinguish between the two. Short term, very difficult. Long term, there are proper solutions.
So if rationing did go ahead, what might it look like? Do you think we'd see households and businesses forced to shut everything down?
So what they've said is that they are going to protect households, they're going to protect hospitals and vulnerable areas of the economy. And there's no suggestion it's going to happen right now. It's just a preliminary and I think quite wise step in order to get the system ready for that potentially to take place. I mean, let's see, because there are plenty of solutions to this. There are negotiations going on. There may well be solutions in the short term.
Well, let's talk about these solutions then. If Russia's gas customers won't pay in rubles, if Russia does go ahead with this plan, what other options are there?
Well, the European Commission and the IEA have both set out a series of solutions to curtail Russian gas imports by the end of the year by 2/3. So they include buying up to 50 BCM of LNG from other countries, which of course means that the global LNG price is going to be higher. It means that the problems being faced by Europe are going to become global problems faced by every other LNG importer. So there's one solution. And another solution is to speed up the deployment of renewables, so more solar and wind, and speed up the electrification of the European industry and heat systems with more heat pumps. And then the other solution is more efficiency. And of course, the final solution is behavioural change, turning down the temperature.
So price rises imminently then, but do you think we're looking at a long-term energy crunch?
Well, Russia is the world's largest producer, largest exporter of fossil fuels. Europe is Russia's largest customer. This is going to mean stress for a long period in the global energy system. And what that in turn will mean, inevitably, is that people will be searching for solutions. And of course, now we do have a solution in the form of renewables, which are 100 times bigger than fossil fuels. They're cheaper, they're everywhere. And I think what this is going to do is going to speed up the energy transition. And it means that peak fossil fuels, fortunately now, is behind us.
So as you say, Europe, a big customer of Russia. Can Russia afford to lose it as a gas customer? It makes roughly $800 million a day from selling gas to Europe.
Well, it depends which day you take it on. Between $400 and $800 million dollars a day, that is indeed true. No, it's going to be a massive problem for Russia. And that's why, in fact, it's highly likely that the two sides will come up with some kind of negotiated settlement in the short term. But again, as I say, the real problem for Russia is if you go to your biggest customer and start waving a large stick, then inevitably that customer is going to find other solutions. So the really interesting development in the last 24 hours is what Andrew Forrest has negotiated with Germany, which is the provision of Australian hydrogen to Germany from solar and wind sources in the Australian desert. This shameful war in Europe is kicking off a global energy revolution where hydrogen will now become or eventually will become the primary traded energy commodity.
So a move potentially to renewables and other fuels. Do you think the EU will be able to slash its consumption of Russian natural gas this year by the goal that it has, which is 2/3? Is that even possible?
Well, of course it's possible if we have to. With all kinds of solutions as I just laid out. It can be done, but it will indeed be painful, not just, as I say, for Europe, but for China, for the world.
OK, Kingsmill Bond from RMI, thanks very much indeed for joining us on the programme today.
Thank you.
The Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez has presented his national plan to Congress aimed at countering the economic impact of the Ukraine invasion.
Shortages on shelves have led to temporary rationing in shops to prevent stockpiling. Our correspondent Rahul Pathak reports.
So in total, $17.5 billion was earmarked to help the country through until the summer. Nearly $7 billion of that will be made available as direct aid, such as petrol subsidies and tax reductions. The rest will go into a state-backed credit system to help reduce the effect of price hikes for families and businesses.
Prices have risen a lot recently. Everything has got more expensive, even in the supermarkets. Sometimes you can't even find the basic products. So I think it's good that the government finally acted to support vulnerable people on low incomes.
Of course, it's always good to help the people in need and try to reduce the burden of rising prices for the population, especially for the more vulnerable, addressing their basic needs.
Car owners and the transport industry will also be relieved. A 20-cent per litre reduction in petrol prices will be introduced across the board. It's hoped that this will help reduce pressure on the economy that saw inflation rates climb to 37-year highs last month. There was also welcome news to help the most vulnerable. Rent increases will be limited to 2% and the minimum income scheme would increase by 15%. The energy benefit programme would also be expanded to include more families.
In the coming weeks, we will put into place extraordinary temporary measures to reduce electricity prices for consumers and for business. They are going to have an immediate impact, not only on the recent increases to the price of our electricity, but also the cost of living in our country.
The Prime Minister also announced that there will be continued support for Ukrainian citizens entering the country, with additional funds being made available to help to make their transition to residency much easier, with more refugee centres being opened right across the country. Rahul Pathak, CGTN, Madrid.
Now let's take you to the United States next to talk about a bank robbery and the gas crisis. Cryptocurrency was once seen as being very secure, far more secure than cash and traditional banking. But now one crypto exchange, the Ronin network, has suffered a robbery bigger than most bank heists. Let's talk to our correspondent John Terrett in New York. We'll talk about the so-called bank robbery in just a moment. I first want to ask you about this German plan to ration natural gas we were hearing about a few moments ago. Any reaction on the markets there yet?
Yeah, I mean, not so much here, but I'll tell you where natural gas is basically traded. It's something called the TTF. The TTF is based in the Netherlands, and it stands for the Title Transfer Facility. And there, within the last couple of hours, the price of natural gas has spiked by between 11 and 15% because of the warning coming from Germany. Now, what is interesting about this is that is 7 times higher than we're paying here in the United States. We pay about $5 per unit, or whatever it is that gas is traded in. I can't remember off the top of my head. And Europe is paying $35. So you could see that's an incredible amount of inflation into an already very inflationary environment around the world. And Europe really has no choice, as you know, as King's Mill Bond was saying, because 40% of the energy into Europe comes in from Russia, so they have to buy this. And the problem is that Putin is saying, look, I want rubles. You know, you want gas, you've got to get rubles. And the G7 is saying, no way, we're simply not doing that. So there's a potential standstill coming up. But the bigger problem, the wider problem, I think, is that if they do insist on gas being paid for in rubles, then will that then be extended to other key commodities such as oil and grain and fertilizer and coal and precious metals, all of which Russia is a major exporter of. Now, Robert Habeck, who's the economy minister in Germany, says this is all blackmail, and he's set out a 3-stage process. Stage 1 is only happening in Germany now, which is a warning that this may happen. I know that they're busy building up their stockpiles for next winter. Things are okay there now, but they're worried about next winter. And, of course, there are issues in other European countries, such as Greece, for example, which is very concerned. They're setting up some kind of committee to monitor the situation. And France has told its people, don't panic, don't panic yet anyway. And indeed, the Germans are setting up a committee to monitor this very, very closely. No problem now, but potentially a big one, as King's Mill Bond was telling us just now, in the months ahead. Guys?
What can you tell us about this crypto heist and how much money was stolen?
Well, I know exactly how much money was stolen, and I know when it happened as well now. It is between $540 million and $615 million, and the reason that it's gone up in the course of the last week, because it happened last Wednesday, which was the 23rd of March, the reason it's gone up is that the value of the haul that was taken has gone up in that sort of 7-day period, or whatever it is. Now, they apparently took tokens and non-fungible tokens as well, and coins, and according to Elliptic, which is an analyst company that monitors these things, this could be the second biggest crypto heist ever. Now, as you said in the intro, it's happened to a company called Ronin, which I'd not heard of them, but it turns out they're based in Singapore, and they're a support ecosystem for online games, one in particular called Axie Infinity. And what happens with it, it's made by a company called Sky Mavis out of Vietnam, and they use the Ethereum-based cryptocurrencies. And then if you're a member of the game, I suppose you win if you're successful, non-fungible tokens, and you collect them, and they also mint them as well. So that's why the theft is so potentially serious. The thieves got away with this because they got hold of what's known as the key, as well as passwords to get into the platform. Ronin says it's working to trace the stuff which is now in the thieves' online digital wallets They reckon they can get most of it back over time. But hacking is a very serious issue now, as you were saying, because it was thought once upon a time that cryptocurrency was completely secure. It turns out not to be. Got to be a problem, I would have thought, for El Salvador, which of course has adopted Bitcoin as its national currency, for goodness sake. So they've got to be worried. Other countries like Mexico and even this one, the United States, is dabbling with the idea of a digital dollar now. But those, the Mexico one, which is further down the line, and the idea which is hatched here in America, would be what they call CBDCs, which is central bank digital currencies. So there would be much, much more control with those digital currencies than the ones that we're talking about today, and Bitcoin and Ethereum and all that kind of stuff. And so the downside of the central bank digital currency would be that it is regulated. And people who are fans of digital currencies don't like that. They prefer the Wild West. But the quid pro quo, as we're now learning, is that these things can be hacked much more easily. Jamie and Robert?
John, thanks for that. Our correspondent in New York, John Terrace.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. Welcome to our troubled world. Ukrainian mothers and their babies suffering the stress of war far from the front line.
It is now important that all of us in Europe act very swiftly.
Fines for the non-vaccinated will most likely be between $1,000 and $4,000.
The new Omicron variant circulating in southern Africa.
The financial markets have also reacted badly to the news.
Growing dissatisfaction with the way the Dutch government is handling the pandemic.
Cancelling the city's main public Christmas markets for the second year in a row.
Protests and riots by those opposed to restrictions and vaccinations.
There is no room for complacency in this ongoing battle against COVID.
On the agenda with me, Stephen Cole, we look up into space. We look down into data. We look at debt. We look at politics. We look at opioids, climate change. We look at all the issues that really matter around the world. But you matter too. We want to tell the stories you want to see and hear about. Make it your agenda.
The agreement is signed. But what is the real deal now the UK has left the EU? For trade, for business, for the city, for ordinary people. Make sense of Brexit with CGTN.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. Attacks continue in northern Ukraine despite Russia's pledge to withdraw.
China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi meets his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov, the first face-to-face meeting since the invasion of Ukraine.
And Germany sets out emergency plans to manage gas supplies, which could include rationing.
Let's take a moment now to take stock on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Our correspondent Luigi Barco has just returned from reporting there. And Luigi, before we ask you to reflect on your time, I want to look ahead for a moment. What compromises might Ukraine have to make in any peace deal?
Well, I think the key fundamental issue for Russia hasn't changed since before the invasion and now, and that's the neutrality
of Ukraine. It doesn't want to see it dragged further west, according to Moscow, and in particular become a NATO member. Now, yesterday in these peace talks in Istanbul, there was some indication that Ukraine may be willing to accept some form of neutral status. But I think the key thing is looking at how that's going to be enforced. Ukraine's government, a few hours after those talks in Istanbul, said it wanted international guarantors, including the Security Council, the likes of the US, the UK, but that also includes China and Russia. So how will that work in practice? Aside from that, it's looking further afield for security guarantees. It wants the likes of Israel, the likes of Poland, its neighbour next door, as well as Turkey and Germany, other countries to act as guarantors. Will all of those be able to agree on an issue like this, given how different their viewpoints have been on the war so far? Some condemning outright Russia's actions, others taking a more calculated approach, it would seem, and one that seems to protect their own interests. So I think that's going to be a really big issue. Aside from that, it's going to be about what ordinary Ukrainians want, because the other key thing the government in Kyiv says is that whatever deal comes, any ceasefire is going to have the full support of Ukrainians. And what we saw on the ground there was a real hardening of attitudes. I was there for several weeks and I didn't meet a single person who had a positive thing to say about Russia. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't certain people who view Russia positively, but what this war has done, whether President Putin saw this coming or not, has really heightened anti-Russia sentiment in the country, and that could be another major stumbling block in terms of getting any future peace deal, if it does materialize, through the Ukrainian people.
What do the coming weeks hold, both militarily and diplomatically?
Well, I think one of the key things that really shocked the world was the diplomatic blowback that Russia suffered, the severity of it, and how swiftly the United States, its allies, and other European powers in particular chose to boycott it, essentially, and cut off lots of financial avenues for Russia. That looks like it's going to stay, even if there is some form of deal that comes to try and stop the violence. Will Russia be allowed back in the fold? Those are diplomatic issues that Moscow is clearly trying to grapple with now, particularly as we've been hearing in the show, looking at changing their contracts to rubles, for example, for energy exports rather than the US dollar. Are they irreversible is another key issue. But diplomatically, I expect very much the next few weeks to be more of the same. As soon as we had the optimism, if you like, last night from Istanbul, markets reacted pretty positively, but quickly the US and UK leaders said that we need to take what President Putin does and look at Russia's actions rather than its words. So I don't think that diplomatic pressure is going to let off anytime soon. The other thing is militarily, once again, we heard earlier in the show from the mayor of Chernihiv, for example, saying that shelling has continued. So there's a big deficit of trust there at the moment. For months, you'll remember, President Putin said his government had no plans to invade Ukraine, and then the world woke up on February 24th to see those attacks. So there is a real big deficit of trust. But one key thing I think that's worth highlighting is, despite the strong Ukrainian resistance, which has gathered a lot of attention internationally recently, if you look at the gains made by Russia in the south and in the east of the country, they have been very widespread, particularly around that key southern area where you have the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea as well. The severity of the attacks indicate that perhaps Russia isn't looking to stay in those areas for the long haul, but perhaps maybe trying to use it as leverage in any future deal and trying to put pressure on Ukraine to become a neutral country. So I expect the military aspect to continue intensifying unless there's some sort of breakthrough, and that means that particularly some of the other players in this conflict need to be looking at how they can influence Russia, particularly the likes of Turkey, Israel, China, India as well, where Foreign Minister Lavrov is set to visit tomorrow. So can those players bring about some sort of settlement? It will be a big gain for them diplomatically if they manage to do that.
Naweed Jabakal, welcome back, and thank you very much.
Pictures of a Ukrainian maternity hospital hit by missiles in Mariupol shocked the world 2 weeks ago.
But across the country, Ukrainian mothers and mothers-to-be are suffering the stress of this war, even if they're far away from the front line. Our correspondent Wu Lei reports.
Another air raid siren. Mothers walk out of the room with their newborn babies and get to safe places. About half an hour later, the alarm cleared. We met Halina, her husband and their son, who was born 1 day ago. Halina is from Kiev. To escape the bombing there, she drove herself to Lviv a week ago, a car trip that took more than 7 hours.
When I saw the explosions with my own eyes, it was very stressful for me. I was worried about my baby and the potential effects on the future.
Halina is not alone. This hospital has received over 150 pregnant women recently, most of them from eastern parts of Ukraine, including Mariupol, Kharkiv and Sumy. 90 of them have delivered their babies so far.
They come here with high levels of stress. They have tears and fear in their eyes because many don't know where to live, what will happen tomorrow. They've lost their houses. All this affects their pregnancy and childbirth.
The World Health Organization estimates that over 80,000 Ukrainian pregnant women are expected to give birth over the next 3 months. Doctors say whether or not they can access prenatal care and stress reduction will have a great impact on their newborns. This hospital is the second largest maternity hospital in Ukraine. Doctors say they help more than 5,000 women deliver babies per year. But over the past month, they've seen an increase in the number of premature deliveries that they link to the crisis.
We need equipment for the neonatal intensive care units, incubators, mechanical ventilation. All this will give us the ability to treat such infants.
Now, mothers aren't required to pay at this hospital for their childbirth, but with the increasing numbers of pregnant women, medical facilities and healthcare system are under huge pressure across Ukraine. This is an old underground basement in the hospital. It's very restricted and low, as we can see. Whenever there is an air raid siren, doctors, nurses, and patients will come here for shelter. The hospital is expecting a new and better basement. New mothers and their infants are among the most vulnerable groups of victims during any conflict. Doctors say they need more medical and humanitarian aid, as well as psychological help to get through this difficult time. Ulay, CGTN, Lviv, Ukraine.
French carmaker Renault is reported to be thinking of handing over its Russian operation to a Russian investor because of political pressure over the war in Ukraine. Last week, it suspended its operations in Russia. Our correspondent Ryan Thompson is following this story for us. So, Ryan, why is Renault only thinking of doing this now when other businesses have already exited Russia?
Hi there, Robin. Well, it appears that Renault is facing pressure from the French state, which remains a 15% shareholder in the car company, down from 19% just a few years back, but still quite an influential amount. According to early reporting that was released today in a number of French publications, it seems that Renault is trying to spin off AutoVAZ, which is their Russian subsidiary production company. It includes about 45,000 employees. Of course, facing all of this political pressure to do something and change operations in Russia, a number of companies are the ideal route here is to transfer the assets through a sale so that they at least can come out with a degree of profitability. Other companies we've seen facing these Western sanctions have ultimately opted to completely end the operations or suspend them altogether. But this is not the preferred choice, we understand, of the Renault executives because of the huge financial cost that would come with such a move, Robin.
And as you say, Ryan, Renault also partly owned by the French government, so does that complicate things?
It does complicate things ultimately for the French government. They've even heard appeals just a few weeks ago from the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, when he was speaking to a special session with the two houses of parliament convened. He specifically named Renault, saying that the French government needs to act. This is an inappropriate action. But he also named a number of other French firms, Auchan, Leroy Merlin. These are companies that are facing increased pressure here in France to end their operations in Russia. Some of them, though, have still refused to do so.
As Western sanctions aimed at crippling the Russian economy begin to bite, Dozens of Western brands have stopped doing business there. Yet a handful of French retailers have so far refused to do the same, despite growing pressure at home. Grocer Auchan, hardware store Leroy Merlin, and cosmetic group Yves Rocher are among the few firms left. The justification, according to Auchan CEO, any exit would strengthen the Russian economic and financial ecosystem, while putting employees and families at risk.
If foreign investors suddenly decide to leave the country and to stop their operation, it would be considered as a fraudulent bankruptcy. All their assets in the country could be nationalized, and then they would probably be sold to other companies, and this would create an income for the Russian state, which could help it to in its war effort.
Auchan says it's no longer actively investing in Russian business ventures, but it's still poised to collect nearly 10% of its global sales there for 2022. Russia has been one of the largest markets for French foreign investment, something the Ukrainian president took note of during an address to French MPs.
French companies must leave the Russian market. Renault, Auchan, Leroy Merlin and others, they must cease to be sponsors of Russia's military machine, sponsors of the killing of children and women, sponsors of rape, robbery and looting by the Russian army.
That appeal from the Ukrainian president appears to have swayed some brands who initially resisted calls to exit the market. The sporting good retailer Decathlon announced Tuesday it was suspending activities. But market analysts point out this comes only after imports had stopped and supplies in Russian stores were running low.
In any case, an exit from the Russian market will be complicated. While only a handful of French retailers are still doing business there, 35 of France's top blue-chip firms are invested. Billions of dollars are likely to be unrecoverable, and unraveling the financial ties will take time.
And Robin, we talk about the bigger economic picture at the end of the report there. France is the third largest foreign investor in Russia, behind Germany and the United Kingdom. So this isn't uniquely a French problem, but the difference here seems to be that companies in the UK and in Germany have been much quicker to pool their assets there.
Ryan Thompson in Paris, thanks very much.
The British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is facing renewed pressure over illegal parties held in government offices during COVID lockdowns. The police have now issued 20 fines, but not to the Prime Minister himself, although more fines could be on the way. Johnson is facing new calls to resign over the matter.
He told the House no rules were broken in Downing Street during lockdown. The police have now concluded there was widespread criminality. The Ministerial Code says that ministers who knowingly mislead the House should resign. Why is he still here?
Investigators must get on with their job, but in the meantime, In the meantime, Mr. Speaker, we are going to get on with our job.
The United Nations has welcomed moves by Yemen's warring sides to call a temporary ceasefire, while calling for a more long-lasting halt to military action to try and ease the humanitarian crisis there.
The Saudi-led coalition fighting Yemen's Houthi rebel group says it will stop attacks on Yemen for 1 month.
Hong Kong authorities say they will boost the city's COVID testing capacity, despite suspending the launch of a citywide testing scheme.
Health experts are predicting a rise in demand for test facilities. Our correspondent Anne Cheng reports.
As Hong Kong mulls over the launch date of a now suspended citywide testing scheme, the focus in battling the coronavirus has shifted into reducing serious illnesses, deaths, and the number of cases. That's as the city's fifth wave has declined to around 7,000 new infections per day, compared to over 70,000 earlier this month. Nevertheless, Chief Executive Carrie Lam says Hong Kong's testing capacity will be increased for nucleic acid tests, also known as PCR tests. One medical expert agrees with this move.
I think we're actually transiting from a pandemic to an endemic phase.
So I think over the next month or so, there will still be a demand for testing capacity until that we can really contain the current wave down to perhaps say less than 1,000 cases a day. I think upscaling the PCR testing is still very important.
He says that a larger testing capacity can facilitate district lockdowns and testing for residents who are traveling back to Hong Kong. Hong Kong's testing capacity is reportedly at around 300,000 per day, and the expert further suggests for this number to be increased to around 500,000. And even though rapid antigen tests have become a popular alternative to PCR tests, Hong stresses that the PCR ones are more accurate, especially for lower viral loads. Meanwhile, the government has resumed issuing compulsory testing notices, which were suspended for about a month after the upsurge in cases overwhelmed the city's testing capacity. And as you can see, they've been issued every day. And these notices mean that people who've been to places deemed high risk on specified dates must take a PCR test within the required deadline. HyberBio, which has 2 labs in the city that operate under a subsidiary called HKMPDC, is one of the companies that processes such compulsory tests. The company says while demand for its testing has decreased since the peak of the outbreak, it has maintained its overall testing capacity of around 110,000 tests per day, which can be ramped up depending on the need.
The main factor would be a combination of various factors, actually. Space, personnel, manpower, as well as the number of instruments. So all these factors combined would limit our testing capacity. But it's a very proportional ramp up. If you want to increase the capacity, it basically means you have to devote the same amount of space, the same amount of manpower, instrument.
He says his lab is still standing by for screening programs like the citywide mass testing, which the chief executive insists is still on the cards. Anne Cheng, CGTN, Hong Kong.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, war on Earth, but peace in heaven. Russian and American cooperation on the International Space Station.
So this is it. I'm just about to be shot.
Tents here, bottles are being thrown as they do so.
There are about 3 critical bridges here in Malawi. That's one of them. We're going to cross that bridge.
As you can see behind me, police forces
who are replying with gas. Gas just came in.
Tear gas. So it's all begun now.
Divisions leading the charge into West Mosul have brought us here.
Just got to be careful here with some gunshots.
This is where most of the fighting has been concentrated.
It's the front line now after 9 days of fighting.
We're about 2 to 3 kilometers from
the front line. Within clear view of this front line position.
Have you ever wondered how much a human life is worth?
Have you ever looked up at the night sky and considered whether aliens are staring back? Or if it's even possible to measure intelligence?
If that sounds like you, it's time to join the Answers Project with me, Stephen Cole.
And me, Mari Beveridge.
We've recruited the best brains in the world, award-winning astrophysicists, giants of medical science, and former presidential advisors to help us tackle humanity's biggest questions.
Find the answers wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. While tensions remain on Earth, Russia and the United States have been cooperating in space to return an astronaut and 2 Russian cosmonauts.
Russia's Soyuz capsule left the International Space Station earlier and landed in Kazakhstan 6 hours later. NASA's Mark Vande Hei ended 355 consecutive days in orbit, returning to Earth with ISS Commander Anton Shapkolarov and fellow cosmonaut Petr Dubrov. Well, let's talk to Professor James Head, who's trained astronaut crews in geology and surface exploration and helped to select the landing sites for the Apollo moon program. James, what's today's mission all about? Is it pretty standard stuff?
Well, it's very interesting. It's, basically understanding the international aspects of space exploration is really critical. I mean, I think today was a very successful demonstration of how 2 countries can work together, that people can work together. I think that's what we need in the long term. All of us have had the experience of traveling to other countries, learning about other cultures, saying, wow, why do they do it that way? That's better than the way we do it. Or maybe I don't like that or whatever, but you understand. And I think cooperation in space, such as we see in the International Space Station, builds a foundation of understanding at the person-to-person level. I mean, these astronauts, both Russian and United States, train in their respective countries. They learn each other's language. They have to speak each other's language. They have to work together. And then they're like in an experimental test tube in the space station for international cooperation. They spend months together. They eat together. They live together. And they come back very, very close friends at the end. So I think international cooperation in this sense is building a foundation for the future. Despite the political difficulties, the people are what count. And we really need to think about people-to-people kinds of cooperation. So that's really what the International Space Station does, I believe.
Well, sorry to interrupt your wonderfully optimistic view, but of course there is a war on. Let me ask you about future work and future collaboration between Russia and other countries. Where does this invasion of Ukraine leave us?
Well, it's a very difficult time, no question about that, and I don't mean to underestimate the significance of this awful situation in Ukraine. I have many Ukrainian scientific colleagues. I'm in communication with them on a daily basis. They're still alive. They're being shelled. It's a terrible, terrible situation. But they're all thinking also to the future. They're very optimistic people, as the Russians are. And you think, I think we really need to, as we do in science, we interact on a person-to-person basis, and that builds trust, if you will. Clearly, the sanctions are really important, and this is going to have an effect. For example, the European Space Agency and Russia will not cooperate on the upcoming mission that was supposed to be launched to Mars. There'll be penalties. There'll be outcomes of that will affect the science. But I think it's critically important to maintain a foundation of interaction so we have something to build on when the situation changes.
In crude terms, could Russia leave someone up there in space or refuse to help out?
Well, I think today was a good example. Mark coming back with 2 Russian colleagues on a Russian spacecraft. I think no one would leave anyone up there. Certainly the United States has the capability commercially to bring back our astronauts and other International Space Station astronauts. And certainly if there was a problem in the International Space Station or with illness, we would certainly bring back any Russian cosmonaut using U.S. vehicles. And I'm hoping, as was demonstrated today, that Russia would do the same, despite the situation.
Briefly, are we able to quantify the impact that the Ukraine invasion has had on scientific exploration in space, or is it too early to say?
No, I think it's a very large impact. Clearly, in planetary exploration, the interactions, we have coordination, which is like, okay, you're doing this, I'm doing that, and we will coordinate. But we have cooperation where we actually work together on something. And the European Space Agency and Russia are working together on something, and that's not going to happen. And I think more of that will take place in the future until the situation in Ukraine is resolved.
James, good to have you back on the programme. Thanks very much for your time and expertise. Professor James Head at Cape Cod.
Thank you very much.
The headlines again. Attacks continue in northern Ukraine despite Russia's pledge to withdraw.
Our other headlines: China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi meets his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov, the first face-to-face meeting since the invasion of Ukraine.
And Germany sets out emergency plans to manage gas supplies, which could include rationing.
And that's it for Global Business Europe. Thank you for watching.
More on all our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
We're on smart TV apps, Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app, and in the UK on Freeview.
Coming up next on CGTN Africa Live. We'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. From all the team here in London, goodbye.
Goodbye.